Here lies one of the great paradoxes of our time. In an age obsessed with revolutionary change, the most radical act may be to conserve. While the world rushes toward abstract solutions and systematic reforms, defending the wisdom embedded in our inherited practices becomes a form of intellectual rebellion. This is not the conservatism of mere resistance, but a deeper understanding that true revolutionary thinking sometimes means recognizing what deserves to be preserved. The real subversives today might not be those demanding wholesale transformation, but those who dare to suggest that accumulated human experience contains wisdom worth defending. In exploring this riddle, we discover that being genuinely conservative in our current moment requires a kind of intellectual courage that challenges the prevailing orthodoxies of planned progress. The question becomes, when does preservation become the most radical position possible? This paradox reveals itself most clearly when we examine how contemporary culture systematically devalues traditional wisdom in favor of expert knowledge, making the defense of inherited practices appear dangerously subversive to established institutional interests. Chapter 1: The Revolutionary Nature of Defending Tradition. In my years of observing political thought, I have witnessed a curious phenomenon. Those who call themselves progressive revolutionaries often exhibit the most rigid adherence to abstract doctrines, while those labeled as conservative often demonstrate the most flexible and adaptive thinking. The supposed revolutionaries march in lockstep toward predetermined utopias, following blueprints drawn by theorists who have never governed a parish, much less a nation. Meanwhile, those who defend tradition must constantly engage with the living complexity of inherited practices, adapting ancient wisdom to contemporary circumstances. Consider how revolutionary it has become to suggest that political activity is an art rather than a science. In universities across America, students are taught that social problems require technical solutions, that human behavior can be predicted and controlled, that the right policy formula will produce the desired social outcome. To challenge this orthodoxy, to insist that politics involves prudential judgment rather than scientific calculation, marks one as a dangerous subversive against the prevailing academic consensus. The conservatism I advocate requires constant intellectual engagement with change. It demands the difficult task of distinguishing between changes that enhance our inherited practices and those that would destroy them. This is far more challenging than the revolutionary's simple formula of sweeping away the old to make room for the new. The conservative must be simultaneously a student of tradition and an interpreter of contemporary needs, constantly negotiating between preservation and adaptation. This intellectual sophistication explains why defending tradition often proves more revolutionary than attacking it. The revolutionary works with simple categories: old versus new, oppressive versus liberating, traditional versus progressive. The conservative must think in complex terms: which elements of our inheritance serve human flourishing, which have become corrupted, and how can we preserve what is valuable while allowing necessary growth? Such nuanced thinking challenges the simplicities that dominate contemporary political discourse. The revolutionary quality of traditional wisdom becomes evident when we observe how it threatens contemporary power structures. Professional bureaucracies depend on the myth that social administration requires specialized expertise unavailable to ordinary citizens. Academic disciplines maintain their authority by claiming that their methodologies provide superior access to truth. Political consultants justify their influence by insisting that governing requires technical knowledge beyond the reach of traditional democratic wisdom. When we defend the authority of inherited practices, we challenge these professional monopolies on social knowledge, revealing the subversive potential of apparently conservative positions. Chapter 2: When Experience Becomes Subversive. We live in an era that systematically devalues experience in favor of expertise. The technocratic mindset assumes that social problems can be solved by applying the right methodology, that human wisdom can be reduced to data points and algorithms. In such a climate, Defending the authority of practical experience becomes a radical act of intellectual resistance that threatens the entire epistemological foundation of modern governance. I have observed how this plays out in American education, where students arrive at universities having been taught that knowledge means information acquisition, that learning consists of mastering techniques for problem solving. To suggest that education should cultivate judgment rather than technique, that it should initiate students into a conversation rather than train them for employment, strikes many as dangerously antiquated. Yet this apparently conservative position challenges the fundamental assumptions of contemporary educational theory and practice. The revolutionary quality of experience-based thinking becomes clear when we examine how it threatens established institutional interests. Professional bureaucracies depend on the myth that social administration requires specialized expertise unavailable to ordinary citizens. When we defend the authority of practical experience, we suggest that the farmer who has worked his land for decades may understand agriculture better than the agricultural economist who has never planted a seed. We propose that parents who have raised children possess insights unavailable to child development specialists who know only theory. We argue that citizens who live with the consequences of policies may judge them more wisely than policy analysts who design them from academic offices. This defense of experiential knowledge reveals why being conservative has become revolutionary in our current context. We are not merely defending old practices against new theories, we are challenging the entire epistemological foundation of modern technocracy. We question whether abstract knowledge can adequately grasp the complexity of human experience, whether systematic planning can improve upon the gradual accommodations worked out through generations of practical engagement with real problems. The subversive implications extend throughout contemporary culture. In medicine, defending the doctor's clinical judgment against algorithmic diagnosis threatens the growing influence of data analytics in healthcare. In law, emphasizing judicial wisdom over systematic rule application challenges the technocratic approach to jurisprudence. In business, valuing entrepreneurial insight over market research contradicts the scientific pretensions of management theory. Each of these positions appears conservative but actually represents a radical challenge to the authority structures that dominate professional life. The deeper revolutionary potential lies in recognizing that experiential knowledge emerges from what I call, following a rite, the patient apprenticeship to inherited practices that allows individuals to develop practical wisdom through engagement with tradition. This understanding threatens the modern assumption that innovation requires liberation from traditional constraints, suggesting instead that genuine creativity emerges from deep familiarity with inherited possibilities. Chapter 3: The Subversion of Complexity. Observe how contemporary political discourse demands simple answers to complex questions. Politicians must reduce intricate issues to sound bites. Activists must frame nuanced problems in terms of clear heroes and villains. Academic experts must propose systematic solutions that can be implemented through policy instruments. In this environment, insisting on complexity becomes a form of intellectual subversion that challenges the fundamental premises of modern governance and democratic participation. The conservative recognition that human affairs resist systematic control challenges the entire project of rational administration that dominates contemporary political thought. When I suggest that political activity resembles sailing rather than engineering, that it requires constant adjustment to changing conditions rather than following predetermined plans, I am questioning the therapeutic understanding of politics that promises to solve social problems through proper policy design. This emphasis on complexity explains why conservative thinking often appears radical to those committed to ideological certainty. The progressive believes that identifying the correct principles will solve political problems through systematic application. The libertarian trusts that applying consistent rules will produce optimal outcomes regardless of context. The technocrat assumes that gathering sufficient data will reveal the best policies for any given situation. Each of these approaches seeks to reduce political complexity to manageable formulas that can be applied universally. Conservative thinking, by contrast, embraces the irreducible complexity of human experience and political life. It recognizes that every political situation involves unique circumstances that resist systematic categorization. It acknowledges that unintended consequences flow from even well-intentioned policies, often producing results opposite to those intended. It accepts that political wisdom consists largely in knowing the limits of what political action can accomplish, rather than expanding governmental authority to address every social problem. This intellectual humility becomes revolutionary in a culture that expects experts to provide confident solutions to every social challenge. When conservatives insist that many problems have no solutions, only accommodations, we challenge the therapeutic understanding of politics that dominates contemporary discourse. When we suggest that the goal of political activity is not to achieve perfection but to maintain tolerable arrangements, we subvert the utopian expectations that fuel modern political movements and justify expanded governmental power. The radical nature of this position becomes clear when we consider its practical implications for American governance. It suggests that most social problems cannot be solved through legislation but require the gradual adaptation of inherited practices. It implies that many inequalities and injustices represent permanent features of human existence rather than temporary obstacles to be overcome through proper policy design. It indicates that political progress consists more in avoiding disasters than in achieving systematic improvements according to abstract theories of justice or efficiency. Chapter 4: Educational Revolution Through Conservation. Nowhere does the revolutionary character of conservatism appear more clearly than in educational theory and practice. While progressive educators promise to liberate students from traditional constraints, conservative education offers the more radical gift of genuine intellectual freedom through disciplined engagement with inherited wisdom. This apparent paradox reveals the deeper revolutionary potential of educational conservatism in challenging the utilitarian assumptions that dominate contemporary schooling. The contemporary university has largely abandoned its traditional mission of liberal education in favor of professional training and research specialization. Students are treated as consumers purchasing credentials for career advancement rather than apprentices entering into a conversation with the greatest minds of human civilization. Knowledge is packaged into discrete courses designed to impart specific skills or information rather than cultivating the capacity for judgment. The curriculum becomes a collection of requirements to be completed rather than an invitation into the ongoing conversation about human experience and meaning. Against this utilitarian understanding, defending liberal education becomes a revolutionary act that challenges the entire vocational orientation of modern schooling. To insist that students should encounter the greatest works of human thought not for their practical utility but for their capacity to cultivate judgment represents a radical challenge to contemporary educational priorities. To argue that education should produce thoughtful human beings rather than efficient workers threatens the economic assumptions that drive educational policy at every level. This conservative vision of education subverts the democratic prejudice that all opinions deserve equal consideration and that learning should validate student experience rather than challenge it. Liberal education necessarily involves discrimination, the recognition that some books are worth reading while others are not, that some ideas have stood the test of time while others have proven ephemeral. That tradition provides standards for judgment that cannot be derived from contemporary preferences alone. Such discrimination appears elitist in a culture committed to educational equality, but actually represents the more democratic commitment to making the best of human thought available to all students. The revolutionary implications extend beyond pedagogical method to challenge the fundamental purposes of higher education in democratic society. Conservative educational philosophy suggests that universities should cultivate citizens capable of prudential judgment rather than experts equipped with technical skills. It implies that democratic life depends on the cultivation of character and wisdom rather than the accumulation of information or the development of critical thinking skills understood as techniques for analysis. The practical consequences of this educational approach extend throughout American political and cultural life. Citizens educated in this tradition bring different expectations to political participation, understanding that democratic governance requires practical wisdom rather than technical expertise. They recognize that political problems resist systematic solution and require the kind of prudential judgment that emerges from engagement with inherited wisdom rather than abstract theorizing about ideal arrangements. Chapter 5: The Individual's Paradox of Freedom. Here lies perhaps the deepest paradox of conservative thought. Genuine individuality emerges not from rejecting tradition but from creative engagement with inherited culture. While contemporary liberalism promises liberation through the rejection of social constraints, conservatism offers the more radical proposition that freedom develops through apprenticeship to tradition. This understanding challenges the romantic notion of self-creation that dominates contemporary American culture and reveals the revolutionary potential of apparently traditional approaches to individual development. Consider how this plays out in American discussions of personal autonomy and self-determination. The prevailing orthodoxy suggests that individuals must choose their own values, create their own identities, and define their own purposes without reference to inherited guidelines or traditional authorities. This apparent liberation, however, often produces not freedom but anxiety, the paralysis of choice without criteria for choosing, the burden of self-creation without inherited resources for the task. Conservative thinking recognizes that meaningful choice requires a framework of inherited possibilities and standards of judgment. The musician achieves creative expression not by ignoring musical tradition but by mastering it sufficiently to make original contributions within established forms. The entrepreneur creates value not by rejecting economic practices but by finding new applications for established principles of exchange and production. The citizen exercises genuine political judgment not by ignoring constitutional traditions but by applying inherited wisdom to contemporary circumstances. This understanding of freedom through tradition becomes revolutionary in a culture that equates liberation with the rejection of authority and tradition. When conservatives argue that individual development requires cultural inheritance, we challenge the therapeutic assumption that authenticity emerges from solitary self-creation. When we insist that meaningful choice presupposes shared standards of value derived from tradition, we subvert the relativistic assumption that all preferences deserve equal respect regardless of their relationship to inherited wisdom. The practical implications of this view extend throughout social life in ways that challenge contemporary assumptions about family, community, and personal development. It suggests that strong communities depend on shared traditions rather than mere aggregations of individual choices or negotiated contracts. It implies that family life requires inherited practices and roles rather than constantly renegotiated relationships based on individual preferences. It indicates that professional excellence emerges from apprenticeship to established standards rather than innovative self-expression unconstrained by traditional expectations. This conservative understanding of individuality proves revolutionary because it challenges the therapeutic culture that dominates contemporary American life. Instead of promising liberation from social constraints, it offers the more demanding invitation to achieve freedom through disciplined engagement with inherited wisdom. Instead of validating every personal choice as equally authentic, it provides criteria for distinguishing between choices that enhance human flourishing and those that diminish it. Instead of treating tradition as oppressive constraint, it reveals inherited culture as the necessary condition for meaningful individual development and creative achievement. Chapter 6: The Conservative Critique of Progress. In our age of perpetual innovation and systematic reform, questioning the ideology of progress represents perhaps the most radical intellectual position possible. While every political movement promises to move society forward toward better arrangements, conservative thought dares to ask whether the direction we call progress actually leads toward human flourishing or represents a dangerous illusion that threatens valuable inherited achievements. This skepticism about progress challenges the fundamental narrative that organizes modern political consciousness and justifies expanded governmental authority. Progressive politics assumes that history moves toward greater justice, equality, and rational organization through conscious human effort. Conservative politics, by contrast, recognizes that change often produces unintended consequences that make human life worse rather than better, and that the presumption should favor inherited arrangements that have proven their worth through survival over time. Consider how this applies to contemporary social policies and reform movements. Progressive reformers approach every social problem with confidence that proper policy design can produce systematic improvement through rational analysis and governmental intervention. They assume that identifying inequalities automatically indicates the need for corrective action. They believe that expert knowledge can determine optimal arrangements for complex social relationships that have evolved gradually through generations of practical experience. Conservative skepticism about such systematic reform appears revolutionary in our current context because it challenges the therapeutic understanding of politics that dominates both major parties. When conservatives suggest that some problems have no solutions, only accommodations, we threaten the professional interests of policy experts who claim to possess techniques for social improvement. When we argue that many reforms produce results opposite to their intentions, we subvert the faith in rational planning that justifies expanded governmental authority over civil life. This critique of progress extends beyond specific policies to challenge the entire temporal orientation of contemporary culture and its relationship to inherited wisdom. Modern consciousness assumes that newer means better, that innovation represents improvement, that traditional practices survive only through ignorance or oppression. Conservative thought recognizes that human wisdom accumulates slowly through generations of practical experience, that innovation often destroys valuable arrangements before their worth is fully appreciated, that the burden of proof should rest on those who propose changes rather than those who defend established practices. The revolutionary implications become clear when we consider practical applications to contemporary American governance. It suggests that most current social problems result from previous attempts at systematic reform rather than from the persistence of traditional arrangements. It implies that social improvement occurs through gradual adaptation of inherited practices rather than comprehensive reconstruction according to rational principles derived from abstract theories of justice or efficiency. It indicates that political wisdom consists more in preventing disasters than in achieving systematic progress toward predetermined goals. Chapter 7: Conservative Practice in Revolutionary Times. The ultimate test of conservative thinking lies not in theoretical formulations but in practical application to contemporary circumstances. In our current American context, defending conservative principles requires constant adaptation to new conditions while maintaining fidelity to inherited wisdom. This delicate balance between preservation and change reveals why conservatism represents the most intellectually demanding and practically revolutionary position available in contemporary political discourse. Consider how conservative principles apply to current debates about technology and social media's impact on democratic life. The progressive response typically involves either uncritical embrace of innovation as inherently beneficial or systematic regulation according to abstract principles of fairness and equality. The conservative approach requires more nuanced judgment, which aspects of technological change enhance human flourishing and which threaten valuable social arrangements. How can we preserve the benefits of inherited practices while adapting to unavoidable changes in material conditions and social organization? This conservative methodology proves revolutionary because it rejects the simplicities that dominate contemporary political discourse and offers a more sophisticated approach to practical problems. Instead of choosing between technological optimism and pessimism, it requires discriminating judgment about particular applications and their effects on inherited practices. Instead of applying universal principles regardless of context, it demands careful attention to specific circumstances and local conditions that shape how general principles should be applied. The practical implications extend throughout American political life in ways that challenge established approaches to governance. In economic policy, conservative thinking suggests that markets work best when embedded in inherited legal and cultural traditions rather than operating according to abstract rational principles derived from economic theory. In foreign policy, it implies that successful diplomacy depends on understanding particular historical relationships rather than applying universal theories of international relations or democratic transformation. In social policy, conservative practice indicates that family and community life flourish through inherited practices and local knowledge rather than systematic intervention according to expert theories of human development. This approach challenges the assumption that social problems require governmental solutions and suggests instead that many difficulties resolve themselves through the adaptive capacity of inherited institutions when allowed to function without bureaucratic interference. Perhaps most importantly, conservative practice in our current context requires intellectual courage to challenge the orthodoxies that dominate educated opinion and professional culture. It means defending the authority of practical experience against the claims of technical expertise, even when such defense appears anti-intellectual to those who confuse expertise with wisdom. It involves insisting on the importance of local knowledge and traditional practices against the homogenizing tendencies of centralized planning and national standardization. This intellectual courage becomes revolutionary precisely because it challenges the fundamental assumptions that organize contemporary political consciousness and justify expanded governmental authority. In defending tradition against innovation, conservatives appear to be looking backward while everyone else moves forward. In reality, we offer the more demanding invitation to achieve genuine improvement through thoughtful engagement with inherited wisdom rather than revolutionary reconstruction according to abstract theories that ignore the complexity of human experience and the fragility of civilized life. Conclusion. The riddle resolves itself when we recognize that in an age obsessed with revolutionary change and systematic reform, the most radical act is often to conserve what deserves preservation. Being conservative in our current moment requires intellectual courage that challenges prevailing orthodoxies about progress, expertise, and the capacity of rational planning to improve human arrangements. It demands the sophisticated judgment to distinguish between changes that enhance inherited wisdom and those that destroy valuable practices without providing adequate substitutes. This is not the conservatism of mere reaction or stubborn resistance to all change, but the more difficult task of preserving human achievements while allowing necessary adaptation to new circumstances. The apparent paradox disappears when we understand that genuine conservation requires constant creative engagement with tradition, a more demanding intellectual discipline than the revolutionary's simple rejection of the past in favor of abstract theories. In defending the complexity of human experience against the simplicities of systematic reform, conservatives offer society its most valuable service, the preservation of wisdom that took generations to accumulate and could be lost in a moment of ideological enthusiasm or technocratic overconfidence.